Margaret of Parma entered the world not as a celebrated infant wrapped in destiny, but as a secret, an inconvenient daughter of Emperor Charles IV, born to a woman history barely paused to record. From the first breath she took, she lived at the fault line of two worlds, noble enough to be used, illegitimate enough to be dismissed, and brilliant enough to unsettle every man who expected obedience instead of intellect. She grew up forged by politics rather than affection, shaped into a diplomat before she ever understood childhood. And when Flanders ignited with religious fury, Philip II sent her into the flames. Not because he trusted her, but because he needed someone who could calm a storm he could not understand. She arrived a negotiator, left a scapegoat, and spent the rest of her life watching the war she had tried to prevent consume the land she once governed. Hers is the story of a woman born in scandal, tempered by duty, and destroyed by a world that preferred bloodshed to compromise. Margaret of Parma entered the world in 1522 as a quiet scandal wrapped in silk. Her birth took place not in a palace, but in the town of Oudenarde, in the Low Countries, a place that, until that moment, had never expected to become the setting of an imperial dilemma. Her mother, Johanna van der Geinst, was a young servant in the household of a Flemish noblewoman. Her father was Charles V, ruler of an empire so vast that people said the sun never set upon it. Their brief encounter produced a child who could never be fully acknowledged, yet could never be allowed to disappear. From the first days of her life, Margaret existed in a space that had no name. She was neither hidden nor embraced. She was visible enough to be used, but inconvenient enough to be denied. For a ruler obsessed with order and reputation, an illegitimate daughter could not be paraded as a victory, but neither could she be wasted. And so Margaret became something that only the most powerful courts of Europe could produce. A child raised not out of affection, but out of strategy. Johanna held her infant daughter for only a short time before Margaret was taken away to be raised by the noble family of de Lannoy. The separation was not unusual for the time, but for Margaret, it symbolized the start of a life shaped by decisions she would never control. She entered the world like a pawn placed on a chessboard long before she learned the rules of the game. And yet, as the years passed, something remarkable began to emerge. Far from wilting under the weight of her unusual origins, Margaret thrived within the strict, formal environment of noble households. The de Lannoy family quickly recognized that this child was different. Even as a girl, Margaret carried herself with an unflinching calm, a composure unusual for someone so young. She spoke little, observed much, and learned quickly. While other children absorbed the manners of court life with uncertain grace, Margaret seemed almost born to it. She demonstrated what contemporaries would later describe as a quasi-virilis temperament, a steadiness of mind and clarity of judgment that many associated with male leadership. This description was not intended as an insult. In the 16th century, it was the highest form of praise a woman could receive. It suggested that Margaret possessed qualities rare even among men: discipline, self-command, and a cool rationality that did not bend easily to emotion. These traits would follow her throughout her life, shaping her destiny more than bloodline ever could. Charles V, though emotionally distant, kept watch over his daughter's development. He understood the political potential she represented. Unlike some rulers who produced numerous illegitimate children and dismissed them as accidents, Charles V was famously cautious. He recognized in Margaret something he often struggled to find in his legitimate heirs: reliability. Charles was a man forever torn between the burdens of empire and the failings of those around him. His son Philip was rigid, intensely devout, and uncomfortable with compromise. His brother Ferdinand was competent, but distant. But Margaret, calm, intelligent, quick to adapt, was different. He could not make her a princess, but he could make her useful. And so Margaret grew up with an unusual kind of authority. Not the authority of birthright, but the authority of expectation. Every household that raised her, first the Delanois, later the court of Brussels under Margaret of Austria, understood that they were shaping a girl destined for a significant, if undefined, role in the future of the Habsburg dynasty. She learned languages, studied statecraft, mastered diplomacy, and absorbed the subtleties of etiquette and negotiation long before most young women of her age understood their own marriage prospects. Still, the shadows of her birth followed her everywhere. She was treated with honor, but reminded in unspoken ways that she would always be slightly outside the golden circle of legitimacy. She attended ceremonies, but never presided over them. She stood near the thrones of her relatives, but never sat on them. She read letters sent by her father, but never received expressions of paternal affection. She existed in a perpetual in-between, visible, valuable, but never fully belonging. Yet Margaret did not resent this. Perhaps because she had never known anything different. Perhaps because she understood, even as a young girl, that power in her world was not given. It was performed, and Margaret performed it flawlessly. She walked, spoke, and negotiated with the authority of someone who might have been born a princess, even if the world refused to call her one. By adolescence, she had developed a reputation within the imperial court as a young woman whose intellect exceeded her status. Diplomats spoke of her calm presence, her sharp memory, her uncanny ability to read the intentions of others. In an age when noble daughters were often educated only enough to be ornamental, Margaret was being prepared, quietly, intentionally, for something far greater. She did not yet know what that future would be. She did not know the storms she would one day face in Flanders, the rebellions she would attempt to calm, or the political fires she would be ordered to extinguish. She did not know she would become governor of provinces more volatile than kingdoms. She did not know she would one day stand between an empire and a war, only to be blamed when the war came anyway. But even as a child, one truth had already taken shape. Margaret of Parma may have been born in scandal, but she carried herself with the quiet gravity of an heir who understood that destiny does not require legitimacy, only strength. Margaret's childhood unfolded not in the embrace of a family, but within the carefully measured corridors of noble households, whose loyalty to the Habsburgs was unquestionable. From her earliest memories, she lived under the implicit understanding that she was not being raised for herself, but for something larger, something political, something calculated, something she was never permitted to refuse. Each day of her youth was orchestrated by adults who saw in her not a child, but an imperial investment. When she was still very young, Charles V entrusted her upbringing to Margaret of Austria, his aunt and one of the most skilled female rulers of the era. This older Margaret, who governed the Netherlands with remarkable tact, recognized in the little girl a mind unusually receptive to discipline and nuance. Under her supervision, the younger Margaret entered a world where childhood softness had no place. Lessons, corrections, and expectations filled the spaces where affection might have lived. Her education was shaped by the greatest political laboratory of the early 16th century, the Burgundian court, with its blend of Spanish solemnity, Flemish practicality, and Italian finesse. Her tutors were not mere instructors, but strategists. They trained her to move gracefully across cultural lines as easily as she walked across marble floors. Languages were her first weapons. She learned Italian, French, Spanish, Latin, and the regional tongues of the Low Countries, not as scholarly exercises, but as tools for negotiation. Each language unlocked different worlds, different alliances, different dangers. She was taught never to speak hastily, never to reveal her true thoughts, never to forget that words could be currency or daggers, depending on how they were shaped. Her physical training was equally deliberate. Margaret rode horses with a confidence that startled visiting diplomats. She fenced, not to prepare for battle, but to develop the reflexes of someone accustomed to maintaining composure under pressure. She practiced dance not for pleasure, but for poise. She learned court etiquette with the precision of a performer who understood that a misstep could be political rather than personal. Even her handwriting was perfected until it mirrored the elegance expected of a royal stateswoman. But the most profound lessons she absorbed were not written in books. They came in the form of silent observations, watching ambassadors argue, seeing nobles bargain for influence, hearing whispers in hallways about rebellions in distant provinces. While other children of her age played with dolls, Margaret's companions were the realities of empire: ambition, diplomacy, compromise, and danger. The young girl learned quickly that affection was a luxury reserved for those with stable families. She had no such certainty. Her mother lived far away, in a world Margaret was not permitted to revisit. Her father was an emperor, always elsewhere, always burdened, always emotionally unreachable. The nobles who raised her were dutiful, but never intimate. They dressed her richly, taught her graciously, and corrected her sharply. Their care was functional, not loving. Still, Margaret found a way to grow within the tight spaces allotted to her. She developed a remarkable self-control, a serenity that made her seem older than her years. She learned to nod politely at decisions she did not choose. She learned to accept praise without believing it came from affection. She learned that her successes were not truly hers. They were rehearsals for a role she would be expected to perform when commanded. By adolescence, her destiny was already being shaped in Madrid and Brussels, cities she had not yet seen, but whose decisions governed every hour of her day. The Habsburgs were preparing her for marriage, one that would serve their political needs, not her desires. In that world, daughters were assets, not participants. But Margaret, unlike many women of her rank, was no fragile ornament. She understood that marriage was only the shell surrounding more complicated expectations. She knew she would not be a simple bride. She would be a representative, an intermediary, perhaps even a tool deployed by her father's will. Her mentors made sure she internalized the fundamental truth of her lineage. Everything she received was conditional. Her clothes symbolized allegiance. Her lessons prepared future alliances. Her manners reflected the honor of a dynasty that would never fully claim her. She learned to navigate the contradiction of being central, yet peripheral, important enough to be molded, yet illegitimate enough to be controlled. This tension forged her into something rare, a woman trained not for domestic life, but for political endurance. She understood statecraft long before she was entrusted with authority. She knew how to read a room, how to steady a negotiation, how to sense danger beneath courtesy. Her life had trained her to expect disappointment without flinching, to adapt without protest, to survive without complaint. But beneath this cultivated calm, Margaret carried a quiet awareness that the empire saw her as both useful and replaceable. She had value, but no guarantee, purpose, but no protection, a role, but no certainty of reward. although she accepted this with outward grace, it left a subtle mark, one that would become visible in later decades, when she faced crises in Flanders and political betrayal from the very family she served. Her upbringing had taught her how to endure, but it had also taught her how deeply the Habsburgs relied on her strength while denying her legitimacy. In her youth, she absorbed the expectations of an empire. In adulthood, she would carry them alone. Margaret entered her teenage years not with dreams of courtship, but with the sober understanding that marriage would be a transaction conducted above her head. She had been prepared for this since childhood. Every lesson in etiquette, every demonstration of diplomacy, every carefully measured gesture had been part of an unspoken curriculum. She was being shaped for a future alliance, not a future family. That moment arrived sooner than anyone expected. At 13, an age when many girls were just learning to navigate the fragile boundaries of adolescence, Margaret was informed that she would be sent to Florence to marry Alessandro de' Medici, the newly installed Duke of Florence and a cousin to the powerful Medici clan. The Habsburgs viewed the union as a strategic masterpiece. Alessandro's rule in Florence was unstable, and Charles V needed a direct familial tie to solidify imperial influence in Italy. Margaret, illegitimate but well-trained, became the perfect solution. If she harbored fear, grief, or resentment, she did not show it. Her composure had long been her armor. She boarded the carriages bound for Italy with the calm dignity expected of a political bride, not a child uprooted from everything familiar. Florence received her with elaborate ceremony, triumphal arches, music, and symbolic gifts meant to project strength and alliance. But beneath the spectacle lay a truth Margaret would come to understand intimately. Public celebration often masked private loneliness. Her marriage to Alessandro was a political pact first, a personal union second, and an emotional connection only in theory. Alessandro was charismatic, but controversial. Admired by some and despised by others for his authoritarian tendencies, Margaret performed her role dutifully, attending ceremonies, hosting diplomatic receptions, and providing the appearance of stability that the Medici so desperately needed. She was 13, yet expected to behave as if she were 30. Barely a year passed before everything collapsed. In January 1537, Alessandro de' Medici was assassinated by a cousin during what was supposed to be a private meeting. Margaret suddenly found herself a widow at 14, thrust into mourning rituals she could barely comprehend, surrounded by courtiers who viewed her more as a political inconvenience than a grieving spouse. She had no children to anchor her place in the Medici dynasty, and no reason to remain in Florence. She returned to the Habsburg sphere not as a princess restored, but as a pawn repositioned. Her widowhood was brief. Charles V, pragmatic to the core, acted swiftly to reassign her. In 1538, Margaret married Ottavio Farnese, grandson of Pope Paul III. The Farnese family sought legitimacy and influence. The Habsburgs sought loyalty in Italy. And Margaret, once again, became the living bridge between two powerful houses. Ottavio was only 14 when they married, young, ambitious, and eager to prove himself. Their early years together were awkward and strained. They lived apart for significant periods, partly due to their age, partly due to political logistics, and partly due to Margaret's discomfort with a marriage that felt more contractual than personal. Yet, unlike her first union, this second marriage gradually developed a form of mutual respect. There was no great passion, no dramatic love story, but there was eventually stability. Margaret fulfilled her obligations without complaint. She bore 2 sons, though only one, Alexander Farnese, survived infancy. Her relationship with Ottavio evolved from icy formality to a functional partnership, strengthened by shared responsibilities and aligned political interests. Still, affection never emerged in the way poets imagined or painters romanticized. Their marriage was an alliance in its purest form, necessary, useful, and expected. For Margaret, these two unions crystallized a truth she had already suspected since childhood. Marriage for women of her rank was never about desire. It was an extension of diplomacy, a chess move enacted with flesh and vows. Love was irrelevant, compatibility optional. Endurance was the only virtue expected. Yet these experiences shaped her in profound ways. She learned to differentiate between emotions and obligations, between personal desire and political necessity. She learned how to maintain her composure during public crises and private disappointments. And she learned how to read men, not in search of intimacy, but in search of leverage. These lessons would become critical years later, when she governed the Netherlands, a region defined by religious tension, noble rivalry, and simmering rebellion. Her cold marriages had prepared her for something unexpected, the ability to remain rational amid chaos. She understood how to negotiate without trusting, how to command without demanding, how to listen without revealing her own thoughts. By the time she reached her early 20s, Margaret had already experienced more upheaval than many women of her era faced in a lifetime. She had been a child raised for politics, a teenage bride in Florence, a widow before adulthood, a strategic partner in Parma, and a mother navigating dynastic expectations. And yet, through all of it, she remained unbroken. Her resilience, quiet, disciplined, almost austere, was not born from privilege, but from necessity. It became the foundation upon which the Habsburgs would later rely when they sent her into the turbulent, combustible world of Flanders. Perhaps they believed that a woman forged by loveless alliances would understand how to negotiate among men who valued power over peace. Perhaps they hoped her calmness would do what their armies could not. Or perhaps, as history suggests, they simply saw in Margaret the perfect intermediary, intelligent enough to act, loyal enough to obey, and controlled enough never to show how deeply these choices affected her. Whatever the case, Margaret's marriages, chilly, strategic, and devoid of romantic illusion, shaped her into the woman who would one day stand between an empire and a rebellion. Not because she sought such a role, but because her entire life had been preparation for it. When Margaret was summoned to take up the governorship of the Netherlands in 1559, she understood instantly that this was not an honor. It was a battlefield. The Low Countries were a mosaic of languages, faiths, and fiercely guarded privileges, a region wealthy enough to tempt kings and proud enough to resist them. Decades of tension had been simmering beneath the varnish of Habsburg rule. And beneath that simmer lay something volatile: religious fracture. Lutheranism, Calvinism, and pockets of radical Protestant groups were taking root in cities like Ghent, Antwerp, and Leiden, where merchants valued autonomy more than obedience. Philip II, newly crowned in Spain, inherited not only his father's empire, but also his blind spots. He believed with unshakable certainty that unity could be achieved only through strict Catholic orthodoxy. The Netherlands needed moderation. Philip sent dogma. The Netherlands needed flexibility. Philip sent edicts. And when these policies began to erode support among the Dutch nobility and the merchant elites, Philip looked for someone who could impose calm without appearing tyrannical. He chose Margaret. It was a calculated decision. She knew the region intimately, having spent much of her youth in the Burgundian and Flemish courts. She spoke its languages, understood its nobles, and recognized the intricate balance between local privileges and royal authority. Even more importantly, she possessed what Philip lacked: the ability to listen, the willingness to negotiate, and the personality to command respect without fear. When she arrived in Brussels, observers noted her presence immediately. She was now in her late 30s, composed, sharp-eyed, dressed not extravagantly, but with a quiet authority that communicated seriousness without ostentation. She entered the court not as a ceremonial figurehead, but as someone who understood that she was stepping into a burning house. From her first days as governor, Margaret confronted a fractured political landscape. Spanish troops stationed in the Netherlands fueled resentment among local nobles who felt their autonomy slipping. The Inquisition, increasingly active, terrified both Protestants and Catholics who opposed religious extremism. Trade routes were disrupted by unrest. Cities whispered the language of rebellion long before anyone dared to admit it aloud. Margaret approached these challenges with a strategy fundamentally different from Philip's rigid absolutism. She convened councils, listened to petitions, and attempted to balance the competing interests of the region's political and religious factions. She treated the Dutch nobles not as subjects to be commanded, but as partners whose cooperation was essential. Her approach was not softness, it was realism. She recognized that an iron-fisted policy would ignite a rebellion rather than prevent one. Her balancing act required a delicate touch. At court, she faced the unyielding presence of Cardinal Granvelle, Philip's trusted minister, whose severity and disregard for local customs made him the most hated man in the Netherlands. Margaret often found herself mediating not between nobles and the crown, but between Granvelle's harsh recommendations and the country's breaking tolerance. She wrote to Philip repeatedly, warning that Granvelle's policies were provoking unrest and urging that he be removed. Philip, slow to act and reluctant to admit misjudgment, resisted. But Margaret persisted. Eventually, under immense pressure, Granvelle was recalled in 1564, a temporary victory that revealed Margaret's political skill, but also exposed her vulnerability. Her success had made her indispensable, yet her authority remained contingent on Philip's trust, a trust that could evaporate at any moment. Despite the removal of Granvelle, the deeper issues remained. Protestant communities pushed for religious freedom. Local nobles demanded an end to the Inquisition. Philip continued to insist on absolute Catholic conformity. Margaret stood in the middle, a bridge stretched between two cliffs that refused to meet. She attempted to introduce moderation into a world sliding toward extremism, issuing instructions that softened enforcement of anti-Protestant edicts. Her goal was pragmatic: prevent violence, stabilize commerce, and maintain allegiance to the crown without plunging the country into chaos. For a time, it worked. Margaret's calm presence, her diplomatic instinct, and her understanding of local sensibilities managed to hold the region together. She was respected for her intelligence, her discipline, and her willingness to hear grievances. Even nobles who distrusted Habsburg authority acknowledged that Margaret governed with fairness and restraint. She walked a tightrope daily, balancing loyalty to Philip with loyalty to the Netherlands' fragile social fabric. But tension continued to rise. Preachers stirred crowds, pamphlets circulated secretly, and in cities like Antwerp, the air crackled with the excitement and danger of reformist defiance. Margaret sensed the storm before most people admitted it was coming. She warned Madrid repeatedly that the situation could not withstand further pressure, that a single spark could ignite the entire region. Philip did not listen. He wanted obedience where obedience was no longer possible. He wanted uniformity where diversity had already taken root. And so Margaret continued her lonely work, attempting to calm the waters while the king who appointed her kept stirring them from afar. Her governorship became an exercise in controlled desperation, containing riots, negotiating with nobles, easing enforcement of royal edicts, writing letter after letter urging restraint. She was not a conqueror, not a zealot, not a tyrant. She was a mediator, a stateswoman sent into a region that no longer believed mediation could save it. And yet, Margaret held the line longer than anyone else could have. She stepped into Flanders as the last hope for a diplomatic solution. But history was moving toward a darker threshold. The storm she feared was already gathering force. She alone saw its shape. She alone understood its cost. And soon, she would be crushed by the very empire that had asked her to prevent it. Margaret's position in the Netherlands became increasingly precarious as the 1560s progressed. She was governing a province where every faction believed itself wronged, where every compromise seemed to anger both sides, and where every decision carried the potential to ignite a new wave of unrest. Yet Margaret maintained her composure, attempting to steer a course between loyalty to Philip and empathy for the people whose lives were unraveling around her. The heart of the crisis lay in religion. The Protestant Reformation had taken deep root in the Low Countries, especially among urban merchants, artisans, and educated townspeople, who resented both ecclesiastical corruption and royal attempts to suppress their beliefs. Margaret understood something Philip never fully grasped. The Netherlands was not Spain. It could not be governed through religious absolutism. Its economy depended on trade, not conformity. Its cities thrived on local autonomy, not centralized control. Tolerance, even if imperfect, had been woven into its identity for generations. Philip, however, saw leniency as weakness. From his palace in Madrid, surrounded by advisors who viewed heresy as a greater threat than rebellion, he issued orders demanding strict enforcement of anti-Protestant edicts. Margaret received these instructions with growing dread. Her letters to Philip became increasingly urgent, warning him that repression would only strengthen the rebellious spirit. She argued for moderation, not because she sympathized with Protestant doctrine, but because she understood the reality on the ground. But Philip's worldview was ironclad. Religion and monarchy were inseparable. Compromise was betrayal. As he tightened his demands, Margaret tightened her efforts to preserve peace. She instructed local officials to enforce the edicts prudently, a strategic choice of language that allowed for flexibility. She issued temporary stays of prosecution, attempting to cool tempers and prevent unnecessary violence. She met with Dutch nobles, urging them to maintain loyalty while she pleaded their case in Madrid. These nobles, particularly the Compromise of Nobles, sought to abolish the Inquisition in the Netherlands and relax anti-Protestant laws. They were not revolutionaries. Many were Catholic. What they opposed was the intrusion of Spanish officials who ignored local customs and ruled with religious zeal rather than political wisdom. When they presented their petition to Margaret in 1566, they did so respectfully, appealing to her reputation for fairness. Margaret listened, not because she agreed with all their demands, but because she understood that ignoring them would be perilous. Yet even as she tried to balance royal authority with local grievances, the forces of extremism were rising on both sides. In August 1566, the crisis erupted in a tidal wave. The iconoclastic fury. Protestant mobs surged through churches, smashing statues, burning altars, and destroying centuries of Catholic art. Shock swept across Europe. For Philip, this was confirmation that heresy had become rebellion. For the Dutch Catholics, it was proof that Protestant radicals were spiraling out of control. For Margaret, it was the nightmare she had foreseen. A single spark that could set the entire country ablaze. Her response was immediate and measured. She mobilized loyal troops, restored order in multiple cities, and warned the nobles that any further violence would force her hand. She condemned the destruction unequivocally, but continued insisting that the rebellion's root causes needed political, not purely military solutions. She believed the fury had been driven not by organized revolt, but by desperation, poverty, and religious frustration left unaddressed for too long. But Philip saw no nuance in the flames. He blamed Margaret's moderation, accusing her, quietly but unmistakably, of allowing heresy to flourish. His letters grew sharper, his instructions more severe. He began consulting hardline advisors who insisted that only a military crackdown could restore order. To them, Margaret's diplomacy was not wisdom, but softness. Her restraint not prudence, but disobedience. Margaret sensed the shift immediately. She was losing Philip's trust. Every step she took toward compromise widened the gulf between them. And yet, she persisted, because she believed, rightly, that violence would plunge the Netherlands into a prolonged war. She saw the merchants who feared reprisals, the nobles walking a tightrope between loyalty and dissent, the ordinary families trapped between two unforgiving visions of faith. She felt responsible for them in a way Philip never did. But pressure mounted daily. Catholic loyalists demanded harsher measures. Protestant leaders accused her of siding with Spain. Nobles who once trusted her began forming factions, unsure whether to remain loyal or to resist. Margaret was no longer a respected mediator. She was a woman standing alone between two tides that refused to recede. Her authority remained intact on paper, but it was crumbling beneath her feet. She wrote desperate warnings to Philip, that sending an army would destroy any chance of reconciliation, that the nobles would rebel, that the cities would resist, that policy must adapt to reality. Her pleas were clear, logical, deeply informed, and ignored. In the charged atmosphere of 1566, Margaret became the embodiment of an impossible ideal: reason in a world turning toward fanaticism. She was expected to uphold Philip's rigid laws while also extinguishing the fires those laws had helped ignite. She bore responsibility without power, obligation without support. And each day, she felt the walls closing in. The tragedy was already in motion. Philip had made his decision. He would send a man who embodied everything Margaret feared. And when he arrived, her work, her restraint, her diplomacy, her delicate balancing act would be swept away in a wave of blood. Margaret did not need a letter or messenger to know that Philip II had lost faith in her. She could feel it in the shifting tone of his instructions, in the cold precision of his demands, in the silence that began to separate one royal response from the next. For years she had worked tirelessly to hold the Netherlands together, soothing nobles, restraining soldiers, negotiating with angry city leaders, and warning Madrid that rigid repression would ignite a catastrophe. But Philip saw the world through a narrower lens. Moderation looked like weakness. Compromise sounded like heresy. And the iconoclastic fury of 1566 confirmed everything he feared. The Netherlands needed diplomacy. Philip decided it needed punishment. And so, in 1567, the king chose his answer. Fernando Alvarez de Toledo, the Duke of Alba, one of Spain's most fearsome commanders, a man forged in war, revered for his discipline and feared for his brutality. If Margaret represented restraint, Alba represented retribution. His arrival would mark the end of any hope for a peaceful solution. Margaret learned of Philip's decision not through private consultation, but as a political fact already in motion. Alba had been appointed. Troops were gathering. Ships were being prepared. Spain was sending not a negotiator, but an army. The message was unmistakable. Philip did not want peace. He wanted obedience, immediate, absolute, unyielding. Margaret felt the floor shift beneath her feet. Everything she had worked to prevent was now inevitable. Alba's methods were no secret. He believed rebellion should be crushed before it had time to breathe. His reputation alone sent tremors through the Netherlands. Cities braced themselves. Nobles whispered in fear. Merchants hid their correspondence. Even loyal Catholics wondered what Spain intended to unleash. Margaret wrote to Philip one last time, begging him to reconsider. She warned that Alba's arrival would push moderates into rebellion, terrify the population, and transform unrest into full-scale conflict. She argued that peaceful negotiation had not failed, only that it required support Madrid refused to give. But Philip's mind was set, hardened by distance and dogma. When Alba finally crossed into the Netherlands with his army in the late summer of 1567, it was as if a storm walked on foot. Soldiers marched in grim columns. Drums carried across the countryside. Cities fell silent as people watched the steel-clad procession pass beneath their walls. Alba rode at the head, stern and controlled, a general who had come not to negotiate, but to judge. Margaret greeted him with the politeness demanded by protocol. But the moment their eyes met, she understood her fate. Alba treated her with formal respect, yet his posture conveyed a simple truth. He believed she had failed. He saw her moderation as weakness, her diplomacy as indulgence, her warnings as excuses. To Alba, order was restored not by listening, but by eliminating threats. Philip had given him sweeping authority that overshadowed Margaret's own. Within days, it was clear she had been replaced in everything but title. The most chilling sign of the new regime came when Alba established the Council of Troubles, a special tribunal tasked with prosecuting those responsible for the recent unrest. The Dutch quickly renamed it the Council of Blood. Its proceedings were swift, ruthless, and merciless. Hundreds were arrested. Dozens of nobles were condemned. Properties were confiscated. Executions followed. The atmosphere of fear spread like a second plague. Margaret watched all of this unfold with a quiet horror that no court chronicle fully captured. She had spent years trying to prevent exactly this outcome, warning Philip that brutality would ignite rebellion, pleading for negotiation, calming frightened towns, and restraining her own officials from needless cruelty. Now she stood by helplessly as the machinery of terror began its work. She was governor in name, but Alba was governor in fact. Her authority had been hollowed out. Her counsel was ignored. Her presence became a formality, a piece of court decorum that had to be maintained until she could be politely dismissed. The nobles who once sought her mediation now avoided her, unsure whether speaking with her would be seen as disloyalty in Alba's eyes. The people who once respected her moderation now saw only the Spanish army that marched in her shadow. Margaret endured the humiliation with characteristic dignity. But even her legendary composure could not mask the grief she felt for the country she had tried to save. She wrote to Philip with a final clarity. If Alba had been sent to assume power, then she had no reason to remain. She requested permission to resign. This time, Philip answered quickly. Permission granted. In December 1567, Margaret of Parma left Brussels. She departed quietly, without triumph, without acknowledgement, without even the gratitude owed to someone who had held the Netherlands together far longer than anyone else could have. Courtiers who saw her go remarked that she walked with the bearing of a leader, but the sadness of someone who understood she had been sacrificed for politics she could not control. Her departure marked the end of moderation in the Netherlands. Alba's regime would plunge the provinces into deeper unrest and help spark what would become the 80 Years' War, a conflict Margaret had foreseen and fought desperately to prevent. History often remembers victories. Margaret's tragedy is that she saw defeat coming long before anyone else, and no one listened. When Margaret left the Netherlands in 1567, she carried with her not only the bitterness of dismissal, but also the knowledge that her warnings had been justified. The country she had tried to hold together with diplomacy was now sliding toward the abyss she had foreseen. The Duke of Alba's harsh regime, executions, confiscations, and the iron machinery of the Council of Blood deepened resentment rather than extinguishing it. Within months of her departure, the Low Countries were no longer a fractured province on the edge of unrest. They were a powder keg waiting for the spark of revolt. Margaret had left as a scapegoat, but she would watch from afar as the disaster she tried to prevent unfolded exactly as she had predicted. Yet history is unkind to those who are proven right too late. After returning to Italy, Margaret settled first in Parma and later in various Habsburg-controlled territories, attempting to rebuild a life that no longer had a clear political purpose. She still commanded respect. She was, after all, the daughter of Charles V and the mother of Alexander Farnese, who would later become one of the most celebrated military commanders in Europe. But respect did not translate into authority. Margaret was now a woman without a realm, a stateswoman without a state. Even so, she did not withdraw completely. Her mind had been trained for governance, not for quiet retirement, and she remained politically engaged in the only ways available to her. She wrote letters offering advice. She analyzed news from the Netherlands with the keen eye of someone who understood its internal fractures better than any general in Madrid. She engaged in discussions with ambassadors and envoys who passed through Parma, many of whom remembered her years in Brussels with admiration. They saw in her a clarity and steadiness lacking in the men who had replaced her. But though she was respected, she was no longer needed. The Habsburg machine had moved on. Philip II kept her at arm's length. He neither condemned her nor welcomed her back into meaningful service. To him, she remained a capable but ultimately expendable figure, a woman whose moderation had been useful until it had become inconvenient. Her presence in Parma represented neither triumph nor disgrace. It represented a political chapter he preferred not to revisit. This ambiguous dismissal weighed heavily on Margaret. For years, she had ruled the Netherlands not with affection, but with duty. Not with idealism, but with realism. She had given stability to a region in chaos, and yet history recorded her departure as if she had been merely replaced, not sacrificed. She watched as Alba's brutal policies backfired, strengthening the rebellion rather than crushing it. She watched nobles she once negotiated with take up arms. She watched cities she had carefully calmed descend into open revolt. And she watched the crown blame everyone but itself. Perhaps Margaret's greatest torment was knowing that she could have helped, if only she had been allowed to. Her son, Alexander Farnese, now rising through military ranks, became a central figure in the later phases of the Dutch revolt. He possessed many of Margaret's qualities: discipline, strategic insight, and an unusual talent for negotiation. Yet even as he grew in fame, Margaret remained distant from the heart of power. She celebrated his victories from afar, proud yet haunted by the knowledge that she had once been entrusted with a similar responsibility, and deprived of the tools she needed to succeed. Her personal life, too, settled into a quiet pattern. She lived primarily in Italy, surrounded by the Farnese court engaging in patronage, religious devotion, and the modest social sphere accessible to a widowed noblewoman. She never remarried. She never sought to construct a public legacy. She seemed to understand that the world she had been shaped for was already slipping away. Europe was entering an era of harder lines, more soldiers, fewer diplomats, more dogma, less compromise. Margaret belonged to an older, more flexible tradition, one that had no place in Philip's vision of empire. Those who visited her in her later years often remarked on her composure, her intelligence, and her memory. Still sharp, still strategic, still alive with the clarity that had defined her governance. She followed political developments with the precision of someone who had once read entire regions like a map. She knew which alliances were fragile, which nobles unreliable, which threats underestimated. But she offered her insights quietly, aware that no one would ask for them. Time had not defeated her mind. It had merely rendered it unnecessary. And yet, Margaret carried no public bitterness. If she harbored anger toward Philip or Alba, she kept it to herself. Her restraint, the very quality that had made her both invaluable and expendable, remained with her until the end. She bore the scars of her dismissal not through complaint, but through silence. The silence of someone who understood the futility of demanding recognition from a world that had already moved on. In the end, her later years were marked not by disgrace, but by a quiet fading. A retreat into the shadows of an empire she had once helped to hold together. She did not fight the obscurity forced upon her. She accepted it with the same realism that had governed her entire life. History remembers battles, not negotiations. Kings, not mediators. Bloodshed, not the people who tried to prevent it. Margaret of Parma belonged to the category history most frequently forgets: the wise. And as the Netherlands plunged deeper into the 80 Years' War, she remained a spectral presence, watching from afar as the land she once governed bled for the choices she had warned against. Margaret's final years unfolded far from the thrones and council chambers where she had once stood as the central axis of an entire region's fate. She spent most of her later life moving between Italy and the Habsburg territories, a dignified but increasingly forgotten presence. Time had a way of dimming what had once seemed urgent. Crises passed, rebellions evolved, rulers changed, and Margaret, who had spent the most formative years of her life navigating the storm that preceded the Dutch Revolt, became a figure remembered by specialists but ignored by the broader machinery of power. By the early 1580s, the world she had once governed was unrecognizable. The Netherlands had descended into the long, grinding conflict that she had attempted to avert. Alba's brutality had hardened opposition. William of Orange had risen as the face of resistance, and Philip's rigid policies had turned a fragile province into a battlefield. Margaret watched from a distance as the 80 Years' War sprawled across generations, consuming cities she had once walked through in her youth. Antwerp, Brussels, Ghent, places she had ruled with patience and caution, were now symbols of a conflict she had predicted with painful accuracy. Yet, even as she observed these developments, Margaret's own life grew smaller, quieter, almost monastic. She corresponded with her son Alexander Farnese, whose military brilliance earned him great prestige as governor of the Spanish Netherlands. There was a certain poetic irony in this. The mother who had been removed for being too moderate now watched her son succeed through a combination of strategy, diplomacy, and controlled force, the very qualities she possessed, but had never been empowered to use fully. Her pride in him was undeniable, but it could not erase the lingering ache of her own political exile. Alexander, for all his success, could not restore the authority she had once held. nor could he undo the decision that had cast her into the shadows. He respected her, wrote to her, and sought her opinions, but he could not rewrite the past. And so Margaret's influence during her final decade remained indirect, a voice heard privately, never publicly acknowledged. As she aged, her circle grew smaller. Many of the nobles who had once worked alongside her were dead, some executed by the Council of Blood, others killed in battles she had tried to prevent, still others lost to time. The European courts that once buzzed with news of her negotiations now mentioned her only in passing, usually in reference to her illustrious son or to the fading memory of Charles III's natural daughter. The world rarely thought of her as a leader in her own right. But even without public recognition, she kept the disciplined routines that had shaped her since childhood. She prayed daily, managed her personal estates with characteristic precision, and maintained correspondence with the few who still valued her insight. Visitors found her calm and sharp-minded, with a memory that seemed untouched by age. She spoke of politics with clarity, but never with bitterness. She seemed to understand that her life had been shaped not merely by choices, but by the structure of an empire that valued obedience more than foresight. As the 1580s drew on, Margaret's health declined. She suffered bouts of exhaustion and intermittent illness, the toll of a lifetime spent in tension, responsibility, and restraint. By 1585, she settled permanently in Ortona, a quiet coastal town far from the centers of European power. It was an unremarkable place for such a remarkable woman, and yet perhaps it suited her final chapter. Peaceful, secluded, untouched by the storms she had once lived within. She died there on January 18th, 1586. Her passing was quiet, almost anonymous. There was no grand Habsburg funeral, no procession of nobles, no masses of courtiers dressed in mourning black. Philip II ordered no monumental tomb. The news of her death circulated in short notices, overshadowed by ongoing military campaigns and political crises. In Madrid, her passing barely registered beyond official courtesies. In Brussels, where she had once stood at the center of the political universe, her name evoked only a faint memory among those old enough to recall her calm presence in council chambers decades earlier. But the silence surrounding her death was itself a commentary on her life. Margaret had served an empire that used her when she was useful, distrusted her when she was inconvenient, and forgot her when she no longer fit the narrative of power. She was the kind of figure history often overlooks, the mediator who prevented greater disasters, the diplomat who stood between extremisms, the woman whose restraint kept a region from collapsing sooner. Yet no statues were raised in her honor. No chronicles praised her foresight. No poets lamented her fall. Her legacy lay instead in the memories of those who had witnessed her grace and steadiness. Statesmen who recalled her intelligence, courtiers who admired her discipline, and ordinary people who, for a brief moment, experienced a governor who listened rather than commanded. If her life ended without grandeur, it did not end without meaning. Margaret of Parma was never the ruler the Habsburgs celebrated, but she was the one they needed and did not deserve. Looking back across the many corridors of Margaret of Parma's life, her story forms a pattern that is both haunting and unmistakably Habsburg. A woman of intelligence and composure, shaped not by affection but by necessity, and remembered not for her achievements, but for the failures others forced upon her. Her life reads almost like a cautionary tale carved into the marble of history, beautiful in its dignity, tragic in its inevitability, and overlooked because it lacked the spectacle of war or the drama of ambition. From the moment she was born, Margaret occupied a liminal space, too noble to be dismissed, too illegitimate to be fully embraced. Her birth as the natural daughter of Charles V placed her at the very center of Europe's mightiest dynasty, and yet at the farthest edges of its legitimacy. This contradiction became the silent melody of her entire life. Always essential, never central, always respected, never trusted, always ready to serve, never allowed to lead freely. Her childhood was a rehearsal for duties no one explained to her. She grew up among nobles who shaped her with the precision of artisans carving a piece meant for the altars of politics. By the time she reached adolescence, she was already fluent in diplomacy, etiquette, and self-control. The tools of a stateswoman forged decades before she would be allowed to govern. Yet these accomplishments came without the warmth of family. She learned early that praise was strategic, affection conditional, and trust a luxury not available to daughters born without a crown. Her marriages repeated this pattern of usefulness without belonging. At 13, she was sent to Florence to fortify an alliance she neither desired nor understood. 1 year later, she was a widow, her grief overshadowed by political necessity. Her second marriage to Ottavio Farnese offered stability, but never affection. Here, again, Margaret's role was not to live, but to serve, to hold together alliances, bear heirs, and lend her name to the architecture of dynastic strategy. She adapted with grace, but never mistook endurance for happiness. Her governorship of the Netherlands was the pinnacle of her life's contradictions. It was the moment she was given real power, and the moment she was most severely constrained by it. Flanders and the Low Countries were not merely provinces. They were fragile ecosystems of autonomy, commerce, and religious diversity. Margaret understood them as few Habsburgs ever did. She recognized that loyalty could be preserved only through negotiation, that force invited rebellion, and that extremism, whether Catholic or Protestant, would tear the region apart. But Philip II did not want a negotiator. He wanted a guardian of doctrine. Margaret tried to bridge the gap between her king's demands and her people's realities. Her moderation held the Netherlands together longer than any chronicler is willing to admit. But history rarely rewards those who stand in the middle. When the iconoclastic fury erupted in 1566, Philip blamed her leniency and sent the Duke of Alba, an iron-handed general who embodied everything she had warned against. Alba's arrival marked the end not only of her authority, but of any chance for peaceful resolution. Margaret resigned, not in defeat but in protest, aware that she could no longer prevent the war she had foreseen. She left Brussels with the dignity of a leader and the heartbreak of a woman betrayed by her own sovereign. And in the years that followed, she watched from afar as the Netherlands descended into the 80 Years' War, a conflict she had tried desperately to prevent. Her predictions were realized with devastating accuracy, yet no one credited her foresight. Her later life became a quiet exile, not imposed, but shaped by neglect. Though she remained respected, she was never again offered real authority. She read reports of battles she once might have prevented. She advised privately, but was never asked publicly. Even her death passed with little fanfare, overshadowed by the very turmoil she had tried to end. The tragedy of Margaret's life is not simply that she was unrecognized. It is that she was unrecognized because she was right. Her story is the story of a woman who served faithfully, led wisely, and sacrificed deeply, and was rewarded with silence. Seen in full, her life reveals the core contradictions she was forced to embody. She was born a scandal, yet raised like a princess. She was used as a diplomatic tool, yet expected to display regal dignity. She governed a nation with intelligence and restraint, yet was blamed for unrest she tried to prevent. She was replaced by a man whose brutality sparked a war that lasted generations. She carried herself as a leader, yet died as a footnote in the empire she served. What emerges most clearly is the profound loneliness of her position. Margaret did not seek glory, but she earned a kind of quiet greatness, one rooted in patience, wisdom, and the courage to pursue peace in an age addicted to violence. She understood political reality better than most of the men who ruled her world. She was not a queen, but she carried the burden of a kingdom. She was not a martyr, but she suffered for her convictions. She was not remembered, but she should have been. In the end, Margaret of Parma stands as a symbol of a recurring historical truth. Sometimes, the most important figures are not the ones who light the fires of history, but the ones who try, often in vain, to keep others from striking the match. In the end, Margaret of Parma's life leaves us with a quiet truth that echoes long after the names of kings and generals fade. Sometimes the most courageous act in a violent age is simply refusing to choose violence. She lived at the fault line between two Europes, one old and rigid, clinging to dogma, and one new and restless, pushing for reform. She tried to bridge them with patience, diplomacy, and the kind of restraint that requires more strength than any army. And for that, she was dismissed. Margaret was not defeated by rebellion or by incompetence. She was defeated by a worldview that valued force more than wisdom. Her tragedy lies in how clearly she saw the storm approaching, how desperately she tried to warn those in power, and how easily they chose to ignore her. She represented the path Europe might have taken, one of negotiation, compromise, and coexistence. Instead, Philip II chose the Duke of Alba, and history followed the road of blood. Her fall reminds us that history rarely honors the peacemakers. It remembers those who win battles, not those who prevent them. It celebrates the spectacle of conquest, not the quiet labor of diplomacy. And yet, without voices like Margaret's, the world would know nothing but fire. She died without monuments, without grand funerals, without songs written in her name. But perhaps her legacy does not need stone or ceremony. It lives in the lesson she left behind. That moderation is not weakness, that empathy is not betrayal, and that political courage sometimes looks like standing alone between two warring extremes. Margaret of Parma was born a scandal, forged into a stateswoman and discarded when her wisdom challenged the ambitions of men. But she walked her path with dignity. She offered peace when others demanded war. And though she was unheard, she was right. That, in the end, is its own kind of immortality.